Not everyone's going to look like a human, not everyone's going to be a human, and sometimes their anatomy is vastly different than ours. Hey guys, what's going on? I hope you're doing well. So this week, I really wanted to get those of you set up who have never read like fantasy romance before, and you're very curious, you want to dip your toe in. This is for you. I'm basically setting you up with a beginner's guide. I'm trying to give you a map to kind of introduce you into this world and get you started on your little path, okay? Because honestly, this is a world. There's so many different parts to it. There's so many different types of books that you can experience. There's actually so many different worlds that you can experience that I feel like, especially if you're coming from historical romance like I did, that's really kind of how I have this video set up. If you're coming from historical romance and coming into this genre, there can be some jarring stuff, okay? So I want to set you up. I'm going to basically give you some book recs that I'd recommend that you start with. I'm going to give you search terms so that way you can find books that I think will really work for you. I'm going to tell you what to avoid, what to look for, and then also just kind of what your expectations kind of really need to be, okay? Because it is very different, especially when you compare it to historical romance, all right? So that being said, let's just get into this bad boy, okay? I have everything set up in chapters, so feel free to jump around if you need to, all right? Cool. So, starting off, fantasy romance, you likely already have an idea of what it is, but just at its absolute barest bones, we're basically existing in a world that is not our own, and there's usually either some sort of magic system to it, or there's creatures, some sort of fantastical creatures to it. Bare bones, that's what fantasy romance is. Now, obviously, you can add a lot onto that to create a variety of different worlds, religious systems, creatures, just sort of political dynamics, all sorts of stuff. So you can probably already see how this really just builds and builds and builds as a genre. All right? So don't worry, like I said, I'm going to help you get set up to find the stuff you like. So firstly, as far as your expectations, the biggest thing is going to be that the POV is totally different. Historicals, oftentimes you're working in a third-person POV. Fantasy romance, more often than not, it's going to be a first-person POV. So you're going to be directly in your character's mind. Secondly, the anticipation and the banter that you really get in historical romances is there, but it's not as prevalent. All right, so it's still like you're gonna get that romance, you're gonna get the sort of like touching hands and building that angst and anticipation, but we have to take a little bit of that out so we can have the chance to explain the world and the creatures and the magic system. Also, the romance typically within fantasy romance books isn't quite the same, mostly because the romance is kind of happening outside of this kind of central plot that's really driving their romance together, but that central plot is much broader and usually a higher stakes than what you get in historicals. You know, historicals, it might be something like, oh, I really need to marry someone so my family doesn't become destitute, things like that. Where a fantasy romance, it's going to be things like, if I don't marry this man, then our two nations are basically going to war and we're going to just kill everybody. Or I need to go into some sort of competition to save the lives of my family because I'm so destitute already. I'm desperate for money, so I need to risk my life in this high-stakes game where I'm going to have to kill other people. You know, you see the difference? So these sort of actionable external plots are really what's driving the romance and bringing our characters together. But these are such serious freaking plots that our characters need to focus on that and not just on the feelings that they're having for each other. Okay? Hopefully that made sense. Also, the intimate scenes typically within fantasy romance is very different, at least in my experience. Most of the time, the way that they're explained, they kind of use a little bit more of crude words when they're kind of describing the scene. They're much more graphic. It's not as softly written, I will say, as in historical romance, but the word choices are very different. I feel like oftentimes in historicals, you kind of work around the body parts and what's happening to get an idea of what the visual would be, where in fantasy romance, they're directly giving you the visual, if that makes sense. Okay? Also, these sort of steamier scenes can happen much earlier on in the actual book than in historicals. Historicals, that's typically like, that's like our climax. They're finally coming together. Or in fantasy romance, it can just happen right away. Not always. You can totally get a slow burn, but I've read ones where it's in the first chapter, okay? Wild, insane. I recommend you stay away from those for the moment, okay? But anyways, moving on, more expectations here. You really should expect within series that they're not going to be standalones anymore. Typically your series is going to be following the same couple across the books, and the first book isn't going to guarantee a happily ever after. Oftentimes it's a happy for now, or it's just a straight cliffhanger and it's just leaving you hanging and you just have to immediately start reading the next book. That's very common. A lot of fantasy romance books are typically series. You can find standalones, but most of the time they're series. So be prepared for that. And then lastly, kind of going back to the intimate scenes again, just be prepared for different sort of like creature anatomy. Not everyone's going to look like a human. Not everyone's going to be a human. And sometimes their anatomy is vastly different than ours. Okay? So be prepared for that. Maybe that is something you should leave for later on. Don't jump into that. Okay? Cool. Now next up, hopefully I didn't scare you there with what you should kind of be expecting. Don't worry, when I give you my sort of like book recommendations at the end, I'm avoiding a lot of that stuff so that way we can slowly get you introduced. Okay? But that being said, let's go over sort of like the stuff you should look for, and then I'll give you some search terms so you can actually find books on your own beyond what I give you. Firstly, as far as the things you should look for, I think starting out, you really kind of need to grasp onto something that you're already comfortable with. So I think you should basically really look for like Regency fantasy romance, Victorian fantasy romance, historical fantasy romance. So that way you're already kind of existing in a world that's at least similar to historical romance. And that way you can kind of understand what the sort of like hierarchies are of the different creatures, let's say, or the different experiences that they're going through, whether it's going to be like they're going to a ball or a Hyde Park or opera, whatever it might be. You're used to that sort of storyline, but now there's going to be some sort of magical element beyond it, or creatures. Like there's a series literally called The Regency Monsters Ball. We'll talk about that later. But that way there's something you can grasp onto. All right? And a lot of the historical fantasy romance books too, a lot of times you're going to notice that they're fairy tale retellings, which is another thing that I actually recommend that you search for, just because you likely know fairy tales, and a lot of the fan or historical romance books we read have fairy tales within them, especially Beauty and the Beast. So if you start off with that, there's something you can already grasp within there. But I think you should add some extra little details within there, especially when you go to the book blurb. If you go onto like Amazon, at the bottom it will kind of tell you like, oh, this is steamy, this is graphic, this is slow burn, things like that. I think the keywords you need to look for is sweet. Clean is optional. That's as far as like if you want the intimate scenes. If you don't want the intimate scenes, use the word clean, but you should look for sweet, potentially clean, slow burn, because I think you'll be really jarred if the first book you read has sex in the first chapter. You know, at least it was jarring for me. Okay, but those are kind of the additional sort of describer words I think you should use. So that's what I would really look for. Avoid anything that is dark, I'd recommend in the beginning, because this can get very, very dark. Okay, fantasy romance can get insanely dark, it can be abusive, it can be toxic. So I recommend we start with the nice fluffy stuff to keep it similar to historical romance. But I also recommend that you avoid reverse harem or any sort of like polyamory storylines. Those can definitely come later. Like, I'm not saying you can never do this. I'm just saying when you very first start out, we need to keep it as similar as possible to the historicals that you're used to. Okay? So we're avoiding dark, we're avoiding reverse harem and polyamory. If, again, at the bottom of Amazon, if it has like the descriptors, it's usually in bold. If it says like it's really steamy or it's graphic sex scenes, I would avoid that for now. Again, you can absolutely do that later. If you're ready for it, jump right in. But like I said, the intimate scenes are described very differently than they are in historicals. You can still have like a spicy fantasy romance that isn't closed door, but it's not going to be as graphic, okay? Personally, I actually really enjoy them, especially now. I've read so many books now that I'm used to the way the intimate scenes are described. But I'm just telling you, It can be jarring. Okay? And then the last thing I think you should sort of avoid is any book that has trigger warnings. Okay? Just because a lot of times trigger warnings are like big right now. Really, really big. Very on trend for very dark, very toxic, sort of crazy situations that can be a lot of fun to read, honestly. But when you're just starting out, it can be a lot. Okay? So just avoid that for now. So again, things to avoid: dark, reverse harem, polyamory, graphic sex scenes, or if it calls it smutty or super steamy, and then any books that have the trigger warnings. So now that you know how to actually find books for yourselves, these book recs, I'm kind of viewing it as like, this is like a good plan for you to start with. I have it lined up for you to kind of like go in this order. By no means do you have to. This is just what I think would be a good sort of like path for you to follow before you start finding your own books. First things first, I think the perfect book for you to start with, especially if you're a historical romance reader, is going to be Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. All right, you guys are going to find a lot of stuff very familiar. It's very sweet, it's cozy, it's light, and it's fun. Okay, it's going to make you laugh. But the whole idea behind it is we have faeries, so there's our fantastical plot, but it's still all set within Regency London. All right, our girl, she's a wallflower. She has like this curse where she only has half a soul, and it's literally the London season, so she's trying to find a match, if you will. She's trying to get married, but it's difficult being a wallflower. But she ends up kind of like running into, basically, he's a fairy, but he's like the least like gentleman of the ton. And he's ill-mannered. He seems like he's a little bit more of a recluse. But he finds out about her condition, and she ends up kind of getting drawn into like high fairy affairs. Okay, so she gets pulled into a little bit more drama. So I think that's a good place for you guys to start. It gives you the taste of fantasy romance, of the fantastical plot, but it's still going to be very comforting and follow a very similar storyline to what you're used to with historicals. So I highly recommend that you start there. After that, or instead of that, if that's just like not jiving with you, there's a series called like The Sense and Sensibility. It's very Jane Austen, but it kind of has, or not Sense and Sensibility, sorry, Scales and Sensibility. But it's a play on Jane Austen stuff, and it has dragons and things like that within it to give you a taste, again, of the fantasy, but still have that comfort of your historical romance. So you can kind of choose whatever you want to do there. After that, I think it would be really good to go into How to Train Your Goblin King, because this is going to deal with fairy tales, or if you've ever seen Labyrinth with David Bowie, I mean, hello. This is a good one to read because it has a little bit more action now than the previous books. So you're going to get used to a little bit more having more of a higher stakes plot, if you will. All right. So the whole idea is we have our girl Floss, and her niece ends up getting stolen away. The Goblin King keeps like proposing to her, and he's very attractive and he's very alluring, but she needs to get her niece. So she has to kind of find her way through this labyrinth, go through all of these challenges in order to rescue her niece. And it sounds like also to like rescue her town. I haven't read it yet, but I want to. But you can see how there's definitely this larger, higher stakes plot, much more action than you typically get in your historicals. But it's like this gas lamp sort of fantasy, so you're still going to get that historical vibe, but also it's a fairy tale. So there's something that you can kind of be used to within that. And it's all still very sweet and very light and very funny. So I think that's a good second or third book, depending on if you read the others, okay? But after that, I think we should start getting grittier. I'd recommend, I have two here because this first one you may not jive with. But the first one I'm recommending is actually ACOTAR. It wasn't my favorite book ever, but ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, it really did launch fantasy romance, and when I read it, I could even see why. She does a phenomenal job at the world building. She's introducing you to this, there's like this very human world that you can recognize and recognize their problems, but then she introduces you to this fantastical world of the fairies and kind of their plight and the issues that are going on with them. There's beauty to it, but there's also some grittiness when you get to certain parts. I won't say anything. but it's also a Beauty and the Beast sort of like reimagining, if you will. So you are going to have some recognition there at the very least. But also at the end of the book, there is some trials that she has to go through that are a little bit more gruesome. This is not a dark book, but it's going to give you the gritty vibe. So that's going to give you an idea after you read this one if you want to stick more to the sweet, light, airy stuff, or if you want to kind of venture into a little bit more of the gritty fantasy romance. Okay? But if you don't want to read ACOTAR, I totally understand. If it's just not jiving with you, or you just don't want to jump on the bandwagon, that's totally fine. I have another sort of grittier option. This one's also kind of rare because most of the time you get enemies to lovers in fantasy romance. But this is a friends to lovers storyline. And it's basically, we have these two nations and they're trying to become allies. They're warring to try to become allies. So they set up an arranged marriage. But they're entirely different species that have different customs, different cultures. They look vastly different. You're seeing these two different species come together and they're immediately are just honest as soon as they meet, thinking that the other person is hideous, but they've accepted their fate and they just would rather try to be friends than try to be enemies right away. So there's this awkwardness, but there's also this like genuine enthusiasm just to get to know each other because they are married. So you see this friendship start and then kind of really blossom into this love that ends up getting more steamy as you go. Okay, so don't feel like you're not going to get those kind of like kicks of like, oh, they're touching each other, they're excited to be with one another, they're flirting. There's that awkward sort of friendship in the beginning that blossoms into, ooh, I actually really like you, you know? That sort of vibe. So you can kind of choose between ACOTAR or Radiance as far as what you want to read. But both of those are going to give you that sort of grittier vibe that you can start to see in fantasy romance. After that, if you're starting to feel like maybe you want to try monsters on, all right? Because fantasy romance has a lot to it. Maybe you don't just want to stick to like fairies and vampires and stuff. Maybe you want to try a kraken. Maybe you want to try a gargoyle. I don't know. That's up to you, man. But there's actually, on KU, there's a whole series called the Regency Monsters Ball, where it's still set in Regency England, so you're going to have that comfortability of knowing kind of what the customs are and what the London society culture does and what their expectations are. So it plays within that, but there's this thing called the Monsters Ball, where a monster's trying to get together with a human. Okay, but these can range, by the way. The steam levels are all very different. So just be aware of that. Some of them can be jarring. I read the Marble Marquis one. I was kind of iffy on that book. But I think that's another good place for you to kind of start to venture into if you want to kind of try monsters on for size. It's just more fun. It's just kind of quirky and different. So you could go into there. There's a variety of different monsters that you can choose from. I think there's like 12 or 13 books in the series. And honestly, along with that, there's this other book that this one's definitely very humorous, but the steam and the intimate scenes in this one is definitely very different, but I think it's a fun read because it's just such a play on historical romance, but is really this sort of like reimagining of Pride and Prejudice, but with aliens, and it's done in such a silly way. Basically, these girls were abducted and these aliens rescued them from bad aliens and are waking them up and telling them, oh, you know, we found out that humans, you can help us breed, but we want to court you. We don't just want to like take you, which by the way, that's common in fantasy romance, but they want to court them. So they need them. Basically, they ask the humans to teach them like how to court them properly. Like how would they want to be courted? And they put like this machine on their head to kind of take these images out of their minds. And these two girls are obsessed with historical romance books. So they just see a bunch of images of like carriage rides and what they do in the shadows of the carriage rides and the balls and all that stuff. So they kind of replicate that, the aliens do. They replicate these balls, these carriages and things like that to court these women. All right, so it's a goofy, sort of easy read that puts a smile on your face. Okay, so that's where I'm going to kind of leave you with as far as book suggestions. After that, you really could go anywhere. If you're feeling up to it and you want to like start diving into dark romance, you can absolutely do that. I just would say with dark, just understand that it's most of the time really, dark means a lot of things. There's subgenres of dark, but I would say what's on trend right now is more of your like dark, toxic, more abusive sort of romances, which there's nothing wrong with reading that, but I just want to use the words that are going to make it really clear to you of like what's going to be in that sort of storyline. Okay? If you want to start with a dark romance, I'm going to recommend Prisoner of Silk by Lydia Foxglove. It's a Sleeping Beauty retelling. It's actually really cool, honestly, because it's a Sleeping Beauty retelling meets Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution. So if you're into that stuff, it was cool how the author kind of brought them together. But that's darker, but not as dark as you can go. I think in the future, I'm going to do more sort of like introductions to fantasy romance, maybe like dark fantasy romance I'll do like an introduction to in the future. But hopefully this got you guys set up. Hopefully you guys are intrigued. I hope if you do read these books, let me know how you liked them. If you found any other books, let me know. I'm always down to read. For those of you who already read fantasy romance and you happen to be watching this video, A, thanks. B, leave a comment of like what book you would actually recommend for people. That way they can go down to the comments and get even more suggestions. Okay, but that's it for me. I will see you guys later, and you guys have just like a great rest of your week. Bye.